For decades, the British monarchy has mastered one skill above all others, not simply the art of ceremony, nor even the burden of duty, but the far more dangerous art of silence, because within the walls of Buckingham Palace and behind the carefully guarded corridors of Kensington Palace, some of the most consequential battles were never announced from balconies, never confirmed in official statements, and never written into the public record. Yet those who understood the language of royal symbolism knew that when silence suddenly becomes louder than headlines, something far bigger is already in motion, and what began as a quiet adjustment inside the House of Windsor may now be evolving into one of the most delicate transfers of influence seen since the reign of Queen Elizabeth II. For months, royal observers believed the future of the crown remained predictable, that the public structure was secure, that King Charles III would continue guiding the institution through a modern and increasingly uncertain era, and that every senior member of the family understood their place within that carefully balanced hierarchy. But insiders who watch royal movements more closely than headlines began noticing something unusual, something so subtle that most people missed it entirely. Because while cameras remained focused on formal engagements, charity appearances, and state receptions, another story was quietly unfolding in the background, and at the center of that story stood not a monarch, not a queen, but Prince William. At first, the sign seemed almost insignificant, a changed seating arrangement here, an altered order of arrival there, private meetings that appeared on no public schedule, senior advisors entering one residence and leaving another, and carefully timed appearances that seemed ordinary to casual viewers. Yet to those who understand how royal power truly operates, symbolism is never accidental, because in the monarchy, placement is language, proximity is strategy, and visibility is authority. Which raises an uncomfortable question that few commentators have dared to ask openly. If these changes were truly routine, then why were they happening with such precision, and more importantly, who was orchestrating them? As that question began circulating quietly among palace circles, one name started appearing with greater frequency, not in headlines, not in public speeches, but in private conversations between former courtiers, constitutional historians, and royal correspondents. And that name was Catherine, Princess of Wales, a woman once introduced to the world as a university sweetheart, then watched by millions as she learned the unforgiving discipline of royal life, and who now, after years of strategic patience, appears to command a level of institutional trust that few modern royals have ever achieved. Because unlike those who chased attention, Catherine built something far more powerful. She built credibility. And in an institution built on continuity, credibility can move mountains. Yet as Catherine's influence quietly expanded, another figure appeared increasingly isolated in the public imagination, and whether by coincidence, circumstance, or deliberate calculation, the growing conversation surrounding Queen Camilla began taking on a very different tone, because while official appearances continued as expected, body language analysts, longtime royal photographers, and even veteran correspondents began noticing subtle but unmistakable changes in positioning, in eye contact, in ceremonial sequencing, and in moments that lasted only seconds but seemed to say far more than any press release ever could. Then came the event that changed everything, not with a scandal, not with a dramatic announcement, but with a single piece of symbolism so small that most viewers nearly missed it, a brooch, worn at precisely the right moment, under precisely the right circumstances, in front of precisely the right people, and within palace circles. Symbols like that are never just jewelry, they are messages, warnings, declarations, and sometimes even challenges. So now the question is no longer whether power inside the House of Windsor is shifting. The real question is this: if the next chapter of the monarchy has already begun, are we witnessing the careful preparation of a future king, or are we watching the opening moves of a royal realignment that could change everything the public thought it understood about the modern crown? The moment that brooch caught the light, the conversation inside royal circles changed almost overnight, because what the public saw as a simple piece of historic jewelry was interpreted very differently by those who have spent their lives studying the coded rituals of the crown, and among former aides, constitutional commentators, and longtime observers of the House of Windsor. One uncomfortable possibility began gaining traction, that this was not a fashion decision, not a sentimental tribute, and certainly not an accidental choice, but the kind of symbolic placement that has, for centuries, quietly announced alliances, drawn invisible boundaries, and reminded everyone in the room exactly where authority truly resides. Inside Buckingham Palace, where tradition is treated less like ceremony and more like constitutional language, even the smallest detail can carry extraordinary meaning, which is why several senior staff members were reportedly seen moving between private offices long after the public engagements had ended, while advisors connected to Prince William appeared increasingly active in meetings that, officially, did not exist. And although no formal statement was ever issued, those who understand how The institution protects itself recognized something deeply familiar, because whenever the monarchy senses instability, its first instinct is not to explain, it is to reposition. And that repositioning appeared to become more visible with every passing week, because at charity events, diplomatic receptions, and carefully staged public appearances, one pattern kept repeating itself, subtle enough to escape casual viewers, yet impossible to ignore for those trained to read royal optics. As William was no longer simply participating in key engagements, he was beginning to lead them, not through speeches or declarations, but through timing, placement, and the unmistakable confidence of someone who no longer waits to be invited into the center of the frame. At the same time, Catherine, Princess of Wales, seemed to be operating with a level of quiet precision that many inside the royal press corps had never seen before, because while headlines focused on wardrobe choices, smiles, and crowd reactions, something far more strategic appeared to be happening beneath the surface, as Catherine began appearing at events historically associated with long-term institutional continuity, military patronages, educational foundations, and diplomatic gatherings, where visibility is never granted without purpose. And every appearance seemed to reinforce the same carefully constructed message, that the future of the monarchy was no longer being introduced, it was being normalized. But if one side appeared to be gaining momentum, another seemed increasingly difficult to read, because observers who had followed Queen Camilla for years began noting subtle shifts that raised more questions than answers, shorter private interactions, altered arrival sequences, moments where expected exchanges simply did not happen, and expressions captured by photographers that seemed to suggest something far more complex than routine protocol, because in royal life, discomfort rarely announces itself through words, it reveals itself through distance. And then came the private luncheon that was never meant to become public, an event attended by senior advisors, trusted family allies, and several figures whose names never appear on official schedules, yet whose influence has shaped generations of royal transitions. And while the palace offered no comment, one detail began circulating among insiders with remarkable consistency, that during a crucial moment in that closed-door gathering, it was not King Charles III who spoke first, and it was not Camilla who commanded the room, but William, calm, measured, and according to those close to the institution, speaking not as an heir preparing for someday, but as a leader preparing for now. And if that report is even partially true, then the implications are far greater than a family disagreement or a temporary shift in public roles, because it suggests that the monarchy may already be doing what it has always done best during uncertain times, quietly building the next center of gravity before the public fully realizes the old one has begun to move. So here's the question very few are willing to ask openly. If the institution is already preparing the path for William and Catherine, then what happens to those who believe their influence inside the crown was secure, and more importantly, when the next public ceremony arrives, who will truly be standing at the center of the royal picture? By the time the next round of public engagements appeared on the official royal calendar, something inside the institution no longer felt merely unusual. It felt deliberate, calculated, and perhaps most telling of all, entirely unspoken. Because while newspapers continued reporting the usual language of duty, continuity, and service, those who study the monarchy at its deepest levels were beginning to notice that the real story was no longer hidden in speeches, interviews, or press briefings. It was unfolding in photographs, in carefully staged entrances, in who entered first, who stood closest, who received the longer conversation, and who, for the first time in years, appeared to be watching power move without being able to control where it was going. At Windsor Castle, during what should have been a routine gathering of senior royals, cameras captured a sequence that immediately sparked intense discussion among royal commentators, because as officials, military representatives, and invited dignitaries moved into position, it was not Queen Camilla who naturally occupied the emotional center of the frame, and it was not even King Charles III who commanded the most visible attention, but instead, almost effortlessly, the focus seemed to settle around Prince William and Catherine, Princess of Wales, not because they demanded it, but because everyone around them appeared to instinctively respond to their presence. That single moment might have been dismissed as coincidence, had it not been followed by another, and then another, and then another, because across military ceremonies, charity receptions, diplomatic dinners, and meetings with institutional leaders, the same pattern began repeating with almost mathematical precision, as William was increasingly placed beside figures who traditionally worked closest to sovereign authority, while Catherine appeared alongside organizations historically associated with long-term royal legacy, constitutional continuity, and future national identity. And when patterns repeat inside the monarchy, experienced observers know one thing with absolute certainty: patterns are rarely accidents. But behind the polished smiles and perfectly timed photographs, another story was beginning to circulate among former courtiers, palace historians, and individuals who have spent decades studying the internal psychology of the crown, because several of them quietly began describing the same phrase in private conversations: parallel influence, a term rarely used publicly, yet deeply understood within royal structures, describing those moments when one center of authority continues to exist officially, while another begins quietly forming around the future, gathering loyalty, trust, and strategic support long before any formal transition is ever announced. And if that interpretation is accurate, then what happened next becomes even more significant, because during a private strategy session reportedly held near Kensington Palace, several longtime advisors connected to different branches of the House of Windsor were seen arriving separately, entering through secondary entrances, avoiding cameras, and leaving hours later without offering a single public comment. Yet what caught the attention of insiders was not who arrived, it was who arrived last. Because according to multiple royal watchers, Camilla's closest allies were noticeably absent. Was it scheduling, coincidence, or something far more strategic? That question only intensified days later when photographers captured a brief but unforgettable exchange during a public reception, a moment lasting less than 5 seconds, where William appeared to lean toward Charles with the calm confidence of a man no longer seeking approval, while Catherine stood just steps away, composed, unreadable, and completely at ease. And for those who understand royal body language, comfort at the center of institutional gravity is never accidental. It is often the clearest sign that someone already knows where the future is heading. Meanwhile, whispers surrounding Camilla grew louder, not through scandal, not through confrontation, but through something potentially far more dangerous in palace politics: silence. Because invitations still came, appearances still happened, duties were still fulfilled. Yet the emotional warmth that once surrounded her public role appeared increasingly difficult to detect, and in institutions built on perception, losing emotional momentum can sometimes matter more than losing formal titles. Which brings us to the question now quietly dividing royal observers on both sides of the Atlantic: if William and Catherine are no longer being prepared for the future but are instead being positioned for influence in the present, then has the House of Windsor already chosen its next center of gravity? And if so, when the next defining ceremony arrives, will the world finally see what the palace has been trying so carefully not to announce? By now, the shifts were becoming impossible to dismiss as coincidence, because what had started as whispers among royal historians, body language experts, and former palace insiders was beginning to evolve into something far more serious. A pattern so consistent, so carefully layered, and so publicly visible that even longtime supporters of the monarchy were beginning to ask whether they were witnessing not a family adjustment, but the early stages of a controlled institutional transition, unfolding in real time, hidden in plain sight beneath the polished rituals of the House of Windsor. Then came the gathering that changed everything. Held inside the historic grounds of Buckingham Palace, the event was designed to project continuity, confidence, and absolute unity, bringing together military leaders, senior advisors, Commonwealth representatives, and members of Britain's oldest institutions, and on paper, it should have been remembered as another flawless display of royal tradition. Another carefully choreographed reminder that the crown remains larger than any individual who temporarily wears it, but within minutes of the first official photographs being released, observers across Britain, North America, and the wider Commonwealth noticed something that immediately triggered intense speculation. For the first time in months, and perhaps for the first time in years, the emotional center of the room was no longer where protocol suggested it should be. Instead of naturally gravitating toward King Charles III and Queen Camilla, cameras, guests, military officers, and even foreign dignitaries appeared almost instinctively drawn toward Prince William and Catherine, Princess of Wales. And while no rule had been broken, no title had changed, and no announcement had been made, those who understand royal optics knew exactly how extraordinary that moment truly was. Because in the monarchy, attention is not merely attention is legitimacy. And then came the image. Captured from an angle few expected, and published before palace media teams could fully control the narrative. The photograph showed Catherine standing beside William, calm, composed, almost impossibly self-assured, while resting just beneath the collar of her gown was the same historic brooch that had already sparked weeks of quiet speculation. But this time the symbolism felt different, stronger, sharper, almost impossible to ignore, because as the light struck the stones, several royal historians immediately identified its deeper association, a piece historically connected not with ceremonial decoration, but with periods of transition, female stewardship, and the silent consolidation of dynastic authority. And if that interpretation was correct, then what happened next may have been even more revealing. As guests moved through the reception line, Cameras captured a brief interaction lasting barely 3 seconds, a moment so small that most viewers missed it entirely. Yet among seasoned royal analysts it became the most replayed footage of the week, because as William greeted one senior military official, Charles appeared to step slightly back, not dramatically, not awkwardly, but just enough to create space, and in that same instant, Camilla's expression appeared to change. Not into anger, not into surprise, but into something far harder to fake, realization. Was it exhaustion, coincidence, or the unmistakable awareness that influence inside the institution was beginning to move beyond traditional lines? That question exploded across royal circles within hours, because while official spokespeople remained silent, several respected commentators quietly pointed out another extraordinary detail. The evening's most important private conversations did not appear to happen near Charles's advisors, nor around Camilla's traditional support network, but increasingly around William's inner circle, a group that, according to former palace staff, has grown significantly stronger over the past year. And perhaps that is what makes this moment so extraordinary, because for centuries the British monarchy has survived not by resisting change, but by recognizing it before the public ever sees it coming, quietly shifting alliances, redistributing visibility, and preparing the next chapter while the cameras remain focused on the current one. So now the question is no longer whether power is shifting inside the House of Windsor. The real question is far more unsettling, because if that brooch was not jewelry, if that photograph was not accidental, and if those 3 silent seconds revealed more than any royal statement ever could, then are we already watching the future monarchy take its position, while the present one slowly begins stepping aside? And if the events of the past few weeks have taught royal watchers anything, it is this: the most important transitions inside the British monarchy rarely begin with a declaration, a speech, or even a headline, because the crown has survived nearly 1,000 years not by reacting publicly to every moment of uncertainty, but by mastering something far more powerful, the ability to move history quietly, patiently, and often so subtly that by the time the public realizes what has changed, the next chapter has already begun. That is exactly why the final gathering of the season, held within the historic ceremonial halls of St. James's Palace, may one day be remembered as far more than another formal engagement, because while the official photographs projected unity, continuity, and confidence, those who study royal institutions frame by frame noticed details that raised questions no palace press office could easily answer. As senior diplomats appeared to seek out conversations not with the current center of power, but increasingly with Prince William, while cultural leaders, military representatives, and longtime institutional allies seemed naturally drawn toward Catherine, Princess of Wales, with a level of familiarity that suggested something much deeper than simple admiration. And perhaps even more revealing was what happened in the moments between the photographs, when cameras briefly captured William speaking with the calm authority of a man who no longer looked like an heir waiting for permission, but like a future sovereign already being treated as an active center of stability, while Catherine, poised and unmistakably composed, appeared less like someone learning the institution and more like someone quietly helping define where it goes next. And for historians of the House of Windsor, there is a profound difference between visibility and acceptance, because visibility can be arranged, but acceptance must be earned over years of consistency, discipline, and trust. Meanwhile, around King Charles III, the atmosphere remained dignified, measured, and undeniably respectful. Yet even some of the monarchy's most loyal observers began quietly acknowledging that the emotional gravity of the institution may now be moving in ways few expected this soon, not through confrontation, not through scandal, and certainly not through public rebellion, but through the oldest mechanism royal institutions have ever used: strategic proximity, carefully managed symbolism, and the silent transfer of confidence from one generation to the next. And where does that leave Queen Camilla? That may be the most delicate question of all, because despite every official appearance, every formal duty, and every carefully maintained display of unity, the quiet conversations surrounding her role have only intensified, not because anyone has openly challenged her position, but because influence inside royal institutions is rarely measured by titles alone. It is measured by who enters the room first, who commands instinctive attention, who receives the private briefings, and who people begin looking toward when uncertainty enters the conversation. And if the past months have revealed anything, it may be that those instincts are beginning to point elsewhere. Could this simply be the natural evolution of a monarchy preparing its future? Or are we witnessing something far more historic, a carefully managed realignment inside the House of Windsor that could define not just the reign of Charles, but the entire legacy of the next generation? Because if history has taught us anything, from the reign of Queen Elizabeth II to every major transition that shaped the modern crown, it is that the monarchy never waits for the public to be ready. it prepares long before anyone realizes preparation has even begun. And perhaps that is what makes this moment so extraordinary, because while the world continues watching official ceremonies, polished speeches, and carefully controlled headlines, the real story may already be unfolding in the spaces between them, in the glances, the symbols, the shifting loyalties, and the quiet rise of two figures who may soon define the next era of royal history. So now we want to hear from you. Do you believe Prince William and Catherine, Princess of Wales, are simply preparing for the future, or do you believe the future has already begun? Share your thoughts in the comments below, because in the world of royalty, sometimes the quietest moments become the most powerful chapters of all. And if you enjoy deep royal analysis, hidden palace dynamics, and the untold stories behind the crown, be sure to subscribe, turn on notifications, and join us for the next chapter, because this story, and perhaps the monarchy itself, may be only just beginning.